You wake up, commute, put in your 8 to 10 hours, and head home, day after day, year after year. And yet, despite the promotions, the extra degrees, and the constant hustle, there is a nagging feeling that financial security is moving further out of reach. The math does not seem to add up. On paper, paychecks are actually larger than they used to be, but the unavoidable costs of daily life are climbing faster than our incomes can keep up. Consider a typical salaried worker. Over the last decade, their monthly pay might have jumped by a solid 66%. But those surface-level gains vanish when you look at the reality of their bank account. The costs for rent, school fees, and medical insurance premiums have nearly doubled in that exact same window. Increased human effort is no longer resulting in an actual increase in wealth. Welcome to the great contradiction. To understand why we feel so stuck, we have to zoom out and look at the broader trajectory of human progress. In the decades following the Second World War, industrial capacity and economic output expanded at a rate the world had never seen. This explosive growth created a specific promise. As the national economy grew, the living standards of the working class would automatically rise along with it. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, technological innovation accelerated that production even further, effectively eliminating historical barriers to manufacturing. We can measure the massive scale of this production by calculating how many hours of human labor it takes to buy an everyday item. This is a page from the 1895 Montgomery Ward catalog, which provides a historical baseline for what consumer goods actually cost in terms of human sweat. Back then, if an average worker wanted a basic one-speed bicycle, they had to trade roughly 260 hours of their labor to afford it. This chart shows the same calculation a century later. By 2000, that bicycle required only 7 hours of work. We see this across the board. A 100-piece dinner set dropped from 44 hours to just 3.6. If we judge our prosperity strictly by our ability to acquire physical goods and consumer technology, we are objectively the richest humans to ever walk the earth. Which brings us right back to our original problem. If the global economy is so incredibly wealthy and efficient, why do you feel like you are falling behind? The answer requires us to track the relationship between the net productivity of the entire economy and the hourly compensation paid to typical workers. This line graph shows those two metrics growing in near-perfect lockstep from 1948 until the late 1970s. As workers produced more value, their standard of living rose proportionately. Then, the relationship breaks. Net productivity skyrockets upward, but the compensation for the median worker completely flatlines. The economists call this divergence the productivity pay gap. It is the structural breaking point where the financial benefits of efficiency stopped flowing to human labor. The wealth is absolutely still being generated, but the transmission mechanism that used to distribute that wealth to the working class has been severed. This structural break reflects a synchronized shift across the global economy. To see exactly who lost out during this transition, we need to look at the global income distribution. This is the elephant curve, tracking how global incomes shifted. Look at this massive dip around the 80th percentile, representing the stagnating incomes of the developed world's middle class. Now look at the far right spike. This shows exactly who captured the wealth. That flatlining wage growth for the middle class collided directly with the skyrocketing cost of actual physical assets. This report from the OECD shows that over a 10-year period, real house prices surged by 37% across high-income countries, aggressively outpacing those stagnant working-class incomes. The skyrocketing price of assets has effectively priced the middle class out of their own stability. We can buy flat-screen televisions and cell phones for a fraction of what older technology used to cost, but the price of a home to put them in requires a lifetime of debt. This is the abundance trap. We have confused our access to cheap consumer technology with the attainment of true, lasting economic wealth. We are living in an era of infinite technological abundance, yet we are completely starved of fundamental economic security. If the economy is producing wealth at record levels, but that wealth isn't going to the workers producing it, where did it all go? The wealth has not vanished. It has been rerouted.
For the vast majority of human history, survival was a brutal, muscular equation. You struck the earth, gathered what grew, and repeated it. We tend to look back at the great empires of antiquity and assume they were wealthy. Rome, Egypt, and Babylon conquered vast territories and organized massive militaries. But those civilizations poured their extracted resources into pharaohs, pyramids, and aqueducts. The reality for 99% of citizens living near those monuments was extreme dirt floor poverty. From the earliest farming settlements all the way to the 18th century, progress moved so slowly that generations lived and died with the exact same standard of living. This chart of global GDP per capita spans over 2 millennia. The line representing the average person's wealth sits just above zero, dead flat, which leaves us with a historical paradox. If human beings spent thousands of years working themselves to the bone, why didn't their daily living standards ever improved? Imagine an ancient agrarian village. One year, a farmer invents a superior plow, resulting in a sudden surplus of wheat. Logically, you would expect that extra food to translate into higher incomes, better nutrition, and an overall wealthier village. But that surplus didn't make the individuals richer. It simply meant fewer people starved, and more children survived to adulthood. Any new wealth the village generated was immediately divided up among a much larger number of mouths to feed. The system automatically corrected itself. Within a generation, the extra food was consumed by the higher population, and the average villager was right back to bare subsistence. In the pre-industrial world, human ingenuity and hard work scaled the size of the population, not the wealth of the individual. Economists call this inescapable cycle the Malthusian trap. Think of human labor and every early agricultural or technological breakthrough as a steady stream of water pouring into a wooden vessel. But the vessel has a hole in the bottom, representing population growth. It drains the resources as fast as they are generated. Because of the leak, the water level inside the bucket, representing the actual wealth per person, never rises, regardless of how much effort pours in. This closed-loop mathematics governed every single empire, kingdom, and dynasty across the globe, without exception. Humanity remained universally poor, because the rigid math of the Malthusian trap guaranteed that population growth would always erase the fruits of their labor. That thousands of years-long trap finally broke in the late 1700s, disrupted by the invention of the steam engine. Instead of relying on the limited output of muscle and animal power, industries could suddenly tap into the massive buried energy reserves of fossil fuels. Mass production began generating physical goods and processing agricultural harvests in a staggering quantity. This explosion of productivity drastically lowered the cost of goods. Suddenly, the purchasing power of an average worker's hour of labor multiplied, making varied products accessible to the masses. Returning to our bucket, industrial production poured wealth into the system faster than population growth could drain it away, forcing the vessel to overflow. Looking back at our GDP chart, we see that 2,000-year flatline hit the Industrial Revolution and shoot nearly straight up, forming a sudden exponential curve. Technology broke the trap and flooded the world with a surplus of capital and goods that outpaced the growth of the population. But the ordinary workers manning those machines didn't automatically capture that wealth. If the Industrial Revolution created so much abundance, why didn't ordinary workers become rich? For most of human history, the global economy operated as a zero-sum game. Because total wealth was fixed, one person's gain required another's loss. This chart tracks global GDP per capita starting in 10,000 BC. For nearly 12,000 years, the line does not move. Across every civilization and continent, there is effectively zero aggregate economic growth. The limit was physical. Production was restricted by the biological energy of muscle. A society could only produce what its laborers and livestock could pull. Agriculture required so much physical exertion that it consumed the very caloric energy it yielded. A farmer worked from sunrise to sunset just to produce enough food to survive until the next harvest. This left no surplus. Without excess energy to invest in new industries, the vast majority of the population remained in a state of subsistence, unable to generate the wealth needed to escape poverty. Occasionally, a society might see a temporary increase in food production due to better weather or new land, but these moments of abundance never led to a permanent rise in living standards. This is the Malthusian trap. When resources increased, populations grew to meet that new supply. More food simply meant more mouths to feed, which quickly pulled the average wealth back down to the survival baseline. The historical data reflects this cycle. An average European commoner in the year 1700 was no wealthier than a commoner in ancient Rome. Breaking this trap required more than just more land or better weather. It required a way to generate energy and goods that did not rely on the laws of biological limits. The shift began with the first industrial revolution and the practical application of steam power. Unlike a horse, a steam engine does not require sleep. This allowed factories to operate continuously, providing a level of mechanical force that human muscle could not replicate. As this technology spread from textiles to mining and transport, the center of human labor began to migrate from the field to the factory floor. For the first time, economic output was no longer tethered to the number of calories a worker could consume. The ceiling on production had been removed. Mechanization introduced the scale effect. In textiles, a few workers operating automated machinery could process more raw fiber than thousands of hand weavers working at home. This efficiency caused the unit cost of essential goods to drop. As it became cheaper to produce clothing, tools, and household items, the purchasing power of the average consumer began to rise. This chart uses 1895 Montgomery Ward catalog data to show the cost of goods in labor hours. A bicycle dropped from 260 hours of work to 7. A 100-piece dinner set fell from 44 hours to 4, and a chair from 24 to 2. This is the point where the 12,000-year flat line breaks. In the 18th century, the GDP per capita line arcs sharply upward, beginning a trajectory of growth that continues to this day. Decoupling output from muscle power allowed societies to accumulate material goods faster than they were consumed. The long-term trajectory of poverty had been reversed. But while the national data showed an explosion of wealth, the immediate experience for those operating the machines was very different. The gross at the top was not reaching the factory floor. The workforce that powered this transition lived in the newly formed industrial slums. These urban centers were often overcrowded and lacked the basic infrastructure to support the thousands of people moving in from the countryside. On the factory floor, laborers were forced to match the relentless speed of the machines. The independence of the artisan was replaced by a system where humans were merely components in a larger mechanical process. To keep costs low, many factories employed children to perform the most dangerous tasks. These young workers often climbed inside active machinery to fix broken threads or clear jams while the gears were still moving. This era also required a massive increase in raw energy. Thousands of men spent their lives in coal mines, performing hazardous labor to provide the fuel that kept the steam engines running. The machines had enriched the nations as a whole, but they had also created a new class of laborers who were often more exhausted and less secure than the farmers who came before them. When we compare the national growth data against the actual wages of these workers, we see a clear separation between productivity and pay. This chart shows the divergence. While the yellow line of GDP per capita climbs, the red line representing average worker wages remains flat for nearly 50 years, creating a widening gap between the value created and the compensation received. This period of stagnant wages during a time of high growth is known as Engel's pause. During these transitions, capital owners capture the productivity gains, while laborers work more for a shrinking share of the total wealth. The machines of the 19th century replaced human muscle, and worker wages froze for half a century. If we are entering a new era where machines replace the human mind, we have to ask if the gap is about to open again.
We are taught that effort leads to security. The standard promise of the modern economy is that as you study, acquire a skill, and put in the hours, your standard of living will rise in tandem with your output. This chart tracks aggregate productivity over the last century. For decades, the promise held. But in the late 1970s, the relationship began to fracture. Economic output per hour accelerates sharply, shooting upward. If we plot the hourly compensation for a typical worker during that same period, the result is a flat line. It drifts horizontally, creating a massive widening wedge between what workers produce and what they are paid. The workforce is generating more value than at any point in history, yet the people providing that labor are no longer capturing the financial rewards of their own increased efficiency. The economy has become structurally uncoupled from human exertion. When wealth no longer tracks with productivity, selling time becomes an increasingly difficult way to build a future.
If the trillions of dollars generated by this boom are not showing up in worker paychecks, we have to look at where that money is physically flowing. Economists track this through the labor share of income. This measures the total percentage of national wealth paid out as wages, salaries, and benefits. Over the last 40 years, that share has fallen by roughly 5% across the majority of developed nations. These gains were redirected into stock buybacks, executive dividends, and the acquisition of capital assets. Corporate structures have transitioned to prioritize the returns of investors over the costs of payroll. This shift means that the value of economic growth now flows primarily to those who own the infrastructure, rather than those who perform the labor. To understand the mechanics of this transfer, we look to the work of economist Thomas Piketty, who identified the engine driving this divergence. It is defined by a simple inequality. R is greater than G. The return on capital outpaces overall economic growth. An engineer's salary is strictly linear, capped by the 24-hour day. But an equity owner's wealth compounds continuously, growing independently of human working hours. This rule has remained constant. In the industrial era, the significant gains went to those who owned the factories, not the individuals operating them. Generational wealth is rarely the result of technical skill alone. It is a function of ownership over the systems where those skills are applied. In the modern era, the returns on capital are accelerating because of a shift in how technology interacts with human work. In previous generations, tools like the typewriter or early PC complemented labor. They acted as an augmentation, making individual workers more valuable to the market. Modern AI and automation are designed to substitute for human tasks entirely. They are built to replace the worker rather than enhance them. When a task is automated, its economic value is transferred. The money that once went to a worker's paycheck moves directly to the software's owner. Technology has transitioned from a tool that lifted middle-class wages into a mechanism that collects and concentrates wealth for those with an ownership stake. We are seeing a period of peak capital concentration, where a handful of hyperscale technology firms dominate the digital landscape. These companies are investing hundreds of billions into AI models and infrastructure, focusing their capital on autonomous systems rather than human workforces. This infrastructure creates a massive financial moat, positioning these asset owners as the primary gatekeepers of the next digital economy. It is a significant challenge to outpace autonomous systems by selling labor alone, especially when those systems operate with 24-hour efficiency and compounding returns. The current economic landscape places a much higher premium on owning equity and digital assets than on the traditional sale of time. This dynamic applies to the global stage as well. Entire nations face the same choice between providing labor or owning capital. Countries that do not own their own AI infrastructure risk being relegated to providing low-value labor, acting as consumers of technology owned elsewhere. Long-term economic power will belong to the sovereign nations that control the compute hardware and the foundation models. AI is resetting the global landscape. The next chapter will explore whether India will emerge as an owner of this new infrastructure or remain a consumer.
Over the last 40 years, the trajectory of the American economy has been defined by a total decoupling of national output and worker pay. Researchers like Lawrence Summers have spent years documenting the mechanics of this divergence across the North American landscape. This data tracks the U.S. economy from 1980 to present. While aggregate labor productivity maintains a steady linear climb, median compensation detaches and stagnates. The widening void between these paths represents the declining labor share, a shrinking percentage of total value reaching the workforce. Industry leaders and media outlets frequently frame this gap as an inevitability of the digital age, claiming that software and AI are systematically replacing human labor. This data from the Stanford AI Index shows how pervasive that expectation has become. In global surveys, 73% of respondents now believe AI will eliminate jobs and disrupt their industries. While the decoupling of productivity and pay is an empirical fact, the assumption that technology is the primary driver of this shift is a fundamental misreading of the data. To model this disruption, policymakers typically rely on a framework called Skill-Biased Technological Change, or SBTC.
This theory rests on a specific historical distinction between rule-based human logic and early computational power. It is anchored in Polanyi's paradox, which posits that computers excel at substituting for routine, rule-based tasks, but cannot replicate the tacit knowledge required for complex work. The SBTC model maps the labor market onto this matrix. Routine rules act as technological substitutes, while high-skill tacit knowledge acts as a complement. Capital flows towards the educated workers in the upper quadrant, whose skills are enhanced and made more valuable by digital tools. This forms the basis of the job polarization hypothesis. While middle-class routine jobs vanish, STEM professionals and high-skilled laborers receive massive wage premiums. If this model were accurate, the architects of the digital economy would be capturing an unprecedented share of national wealth. The actual career data for these workers suggests otherwise. We can test the validity of the SBTC model by looking at the very cohort it is designed to reward, STEM professionals. Recent labor data reveals a contradiction. Modern STEM careers are increasingly defined by shrinking job tenure and reduced security, declining returns on university education. The SBTC model assumes that value is generated purely in the classroom, ignoring the fact that high-value skills require sustained on-the-job training within a firm to remain relevant. At the firm level, these trends are driven by a systemic transition from the old economy business model to the new economy business model. The old economy model functioned as a continuous loop. Firms retained capital and reinvested it into internal training, which translated into rising wages over decades of employment. Modern tech and pharmaceutical giants have largely abandoned this structure, trading long-term career investment for upfront stock options. Under the new economy model, that reinvestment loop breaks. Instead of funding worker development, firm profits are aggressively diverted toward external financial markets. This redirection of capital is a hallmark of the broader financialization of the American economy. The scale of this diversion is visible in the pharmaceutical sector. Pfizer and Merck route 66% and 42% of their net income, respectively, into immediate stock buybacks. When dividend payouts are added to the ledger, total financial outflows can exceed 100% of net income. Capital is being extracted from these firms faster than it is being generated.
Without firm-sponsored training, the value of a worker's education depreciates rapidly, causing expected earnings to drop just as these skilled professionals reach their most productive years in their 40s and 50s. Corporate financialization prioritizes short-term equity inflation over human capital, turning STEM wage stagnation into a deliberate structural feature rather than a technological side effect. If automation isn't the primary driver of wage suppression at the firm level, we have to re-examine what is pulling down the national labor share of income. The labor share is a mathematical ratio, which means it can be heavily influenced by shifts in specific sectors that have nothing to do with technology. A single sector is responsible for the largest statistical distortion in modern macroeconomic data. To understand the decline of the labor share, we have to look past the top-line aggregates and isolate the footprint of the real estate industry.
This chart tracks the share of real estate services within total business sector value added over a 45-year period. The data shows a massive surge in the sector's economic weight, representing a huge influx of capital into property. The lines for Spain and the United States show particularly extreme peaks, reflecting the housing booms that preceded the 2008 financial crisis. Real estate is uniquely capital-intensive. It generates massive economic value while requiring very little, if any, actual human labor. This changes the math of the labor share equation, total compensation divided by total economic value added. As real estate values balloon, the denominator of this fraction swells, mathematically forcing the resulting labor share percentage downward. Under this mathematical reality, the national labor share can drop precipitously, even if technology hasn't displaced a single worker in the broader economy. Much of the reported decline in the labor share is a byproduct of real estate inflation, casting serious doubt on the idea that automation is the primary engine of this shift. The broken link between productivity and pay is driven by two distinct forces: micro-level stock buyback cycles and macro-level real estate distortions. When we combine the fractured capital loops of the modern firm with the inflating real estate denominator, a clearer picture of our economic reality emerges. Education levels fail to explain why inequality is rising, even among workers with identical training, a fact that mathematically isolates technology as a secondary variable. The current fixation on AI often serves to obscure the impact of globalization, weakened labor unions, and the systematic prioritization of shareholder equity. Attributing wage stagnation to robots and algorithms allows the specific financial and sectoral mechanisms driving this crisis to continue operating without oversight. If modern corporations no longer internalize the cost of worker development, the state must take a direct role in funding the necessary human capital. There is historical precedent for this level of state intervention, dating back to executive committees formed in the 1960s. An economy built on the new business model requires state-funded transitional education and free universal re-education programs. To support workers during these shifts, policymakers have previously proposed a guaranteed minimum income. This floor provides the stability necessary for workers to navigate an economy where skills depreciate rapidly, allowing them to retrain without exhausting their personal savings. Addressing the crisis of stagnant wages requires looking past the fear of automation and recognizing the broken link as a failure of corporate and sectoral architecture that only state action can resolve.
In 1895, if an average worker wanted to buy a one-speed bicycle, they had to work 260 hours to afford it. By the year 2000, thanks to mass manufacturing and technological progress, that exact same purchase required just 7.2 hours of labor. We are surrounded by this kind of historical abundance. Yet the financial anxiety of the modern worker is acute. Recent OECD surveys show that 60% of young adults aged 18 to 39 are deeply worried about basic housing affordability, compared to just 38% of their parents' generation. This diagram shows a personal balance sheet divided into 3 sections: your income, your expenses, and your time. To understand modern financial anxiety, we have to look at how each of these pillars is actively being squeezed. For most of the 20th century, technological growth translated reliably into personal wealth. Workers produced more, and their wages rose accordingly. But that equation has broken down. If you feel like you are working harder than ever but falling further behind, it is not a personal failure. It is the mathematical outcome of a system that now extracts value from every single line of your ledger. This chart shows how productivity and typical worker pay moved together in lockstep for decades, until the mid-1970s. Since then, the overall output of the economy has soared, but the median worker's compensation has flatlined. Mainstream economic theory often claimed that new technology would naturally boost the wages of skilled workers. The data reveals a different story. Automation displaced workers from routine tasks entirely, hollowing out middle-class earnings and pushing laborers into lower-paying service jobs. It did not simply complement existing skills as economists once assumed. At the same time, corporations abandoned the old model of investing in long-term employee training and career tenure. Under the new economy model, major tech and pharmaceutical companies began prioritizing immediate financial returns. Profits that once funded worker development are now routinely redirected into stock buybacks and dividends to artificially inflate share prices. When structural automation eliminates middle-tier jobs and corporate profits are exclusively funneled toward shareholders, the result for the average worker is a permanent, systemic income deficit. As routine jobs vanish, displaced labor often migrates to the gig economy. Platforms market this work as a path to autonomy and flexible entrepreneurship, but the reality is heavily managed by invisible code. Digital platforms use algorithmic management to direct behavior, set rates, and evaluate performance without ever classifying the driver or courier as an employee. By labeling workers as independent contractors, these companies legally circumvent the stable employer-employee relationship and the social protections that come with it. A comparative study of over 2,000 gig workers across 6 Indian platforms measured the impact of this arrangement. The research found severe well-being deficits for gig workers relative to salaried employees, particularly regarding job security, income adequacy, and access to basic social protection. The promised flexibility of platform work often masks a systematic withdrawal of the worker's right to predictable earnings and basic safety nets. Even if a worker manages to stabilize the income side of their ledger, they immediately hit the second column, expenses,
And the relentless driver of modern poverty is the cost of shelter. Over the past 3 decades across OECD countries, real house prices have increased by nearly 60 index points. Housing has consistently become less affordable relative to the actual incomes people bring home. Economists measure this using a price-to-income ratio, calculating the nominal house price against the disposable income per person. When that ratio climbs year after year, it means incomes are entirely failing to keep pace with the cost of property. Without property ownership, the middle class has no reliable mechanism to build equity. Uncontained housing costs act as a massive wealth vacuum, absorbing whatever minor wage gains a worker might secure. Finally, we arrive at the third column, time. The digital platforms and free services we use every day are actually operating as highly efficient brokers for human attention. In the 1970s, economist Herbert Simon noted that a wealth of information necessarily creates a poverty of attention. Today, human cognitive focus is treated as a scarce, valuable commodity to be algorithmically captured, analyzed, and traded for profit. This visualization shows how a user's time spent is converted into behavioral data and then auctioned as targeted ad space. To keep the auctions running, platforms design algorithms that prioritize user retention above all else, keeping us locked in endless, outrage-driven dopamine loops. The modern economy does not stop at extracting your labor or inflating your living costs. It has evolved to monetize your cognitive bandwidth, extracting your very ability to focus and think. This ledger shows the reality of our current financial equation. Income is suppressed by automation and corporate financialization. Expenses are inflated by a runaway housing market, and your remaining time is strip-mined by the attention economy. You cannot out-hustle a math problem this severe. Upskilling or working longer hours won't fix a structurally broken ledger. Correcting this requires policy-level interventions, like portable benefits that follow a worker from job to job, and aggressive housing reform. There are early signs of legislative pushback. For instance, the Indian Code on Social Security 2020 represents a first step toward acknowledging these new economic realities, creating a framework to extend social safety nets to gig workers. You are not working more and getting less rich because you failed to save enough or work hard enough. The balance sheet of the 21st century has simply been redrawn to favor extraction over labor.